These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. These early 20th century dolls were given waxy faces and glass eyes so they would look like real babies in studio photos. Now their fixed smiles and matching stares feel less like toys and more like a strange little family quietly watching you. This 1984 photo shows a Soviet farm building where workers and cows used the same wall openings during construction. The repeated pairs of legs sticking out of the bricks turn a simple work moment into a strange pattern. In Kerala, India, in 2001, a series of deep red rainfalls stained walls and clothes pink and was collected in jars like you see here. Later studies showed the color came from huge numbers of airborne algae spores. This early 1900 three-wheeled logging truck hauls a single tree so large its trunk is wider than the cab. One fallen giant like this could supply enough timber for a small house, which is why entire crews were devoted to moving just one log at a time. On 22 June 1941, Soviet archaeologists opened Tamerlane's tomb, ignoring a warning that a new conqueror would come. That same day, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and soon after his reburial in 1942, the Soviet push at Stalingrad began. This 1970s photo shows a Soviet stage band in white suits balancing on boards over deep mud on the way to a remote concert. The clash between their polished guitars and the rough field shows how official pop music was sent to perform even in the most unlikely village venues. On Christmas Eve 1945, the Solder home burned down in about 45 minutes, and 5 children vanished with no trace in the ashes. A cut phone line, a fire truck that would not start, and later reports of the children in a passing car turned it into one of America's longest-running family mysteries. This 1918 photo shows a German mechanical trench digger on the Western Front, built to cut defensive lines faster than shovel teams. Its chain of buckets could bite into the soil and move forward non-stop, turning ground into a moving belt of earth. On 30 June 1908, a space object exploded over Tunguska in Siberia with energy estimated at about 10 to 15 megatons, flattening around 80 million trees. Scientists still study the Tunguska event because the air burst left no crater and left a ring of standing. In 1937, a very tall man, well over 2 meters, was photographed on a custom-length bed beside a much shorter man for scale. At that time, such images of special furniture for unusually tall people were printed in newspapers as human curiosities. In February 1959 at Dyatlov Pass, 9 experienced hikers cut their tent open from the inside and ran out into minus 30 degrees, wearing almost no clothes. Their bodies were later found in the snow with severe chest and skull fractures, missing soft tissue on some faces. In 1927 in the United States, women lined up on a grass track to run races alongside their dogs in a special combined event. Such races were part of 1920s novelty sports, where organizers tested unusual race ideas to attract bigger crowds. In August 1915 at Gallipoli, New Zealand engineers reported that about 260 British soldiers marched into a strange low cloud on a hill and never reappeared. After the war, Turkish records showed no prisoners from that unit, and the men were listed as missing in action. On 25 April 1945, Soviet and American soldiers met at Torgau on the Elbe River, linking their fronts and posing for photos with arms around each other. This meeting cut Nazi Germany in two and became a symbol of Allied cooperation in the final days of the war. On 22 May 1968, the nuclear submarine USS Scorpion disappeared in the Atlantic with 99 crew members, and its wreck was found 5 months later at a depth of about 3,000 meters. This Norwegian farming family was photographed around 1910, when rural households often lived in isolated valleys and children commonly shared the same pale eyes and sharp features. Long exposure times and customs of the era meant people posed without smiles. On 21 August 1986, Lake Nyos in Cameroon suddenly released about 300,000 tons of carbon dioxide in roughly 20 seconds, and the gas rolled into nearby valleys. This 1899 photograph from Qajar-era Persia shows prisoners sitting in heavy iron collars linked by a single chain while guards stand nearby. It is one of the few images documenting how convicts were kept in windowless stone prisons. On 1 September 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake triggered a fire whirl in Tokyo about 30 meters high. Around 40,000 people who had gathered on an open square died there in about 15 minutes, making it one of the deadliest fire disasters ever recorded. This 1966 photo shows a young boy in Nepal greeting the photographer with the traditional namaste gesture, palms pressed together in respect. In 1948, the cargo ship Urang Medan was reportedly found adrift after a radio message saying that all officers were gone and the operator was dying. When a rescue crew tried to tow the empty ship, it suddenly exploded and sank. This photograph shows a biplane in London around 1917, lodged in trees beside the Thames while a crowd gathers below. Early pilots in the First World War era trained at low altitude without modern instruments, so collisions with buildings and trees were a regular risk. In 1927, the Great Mississippi Flood covered about 70,000 square kilometers and raised the river up to 10 meters above normal. Around 700,000 people were displaced for weeks on rooftops, and hundreds of people lost their lives. In 1961, American actress Julie Newmar posed in a corset-style outfit in a farm field for a pin-up-style photo shoot. She stands beside a scarecrow, copying its outstretched arms and matching cap, turning the field guard into her visual partner in the frame. In 1967, the Patterson-Gimlin film captured 59 seconds of a large, ape-like figure walking through a forest in California. For decades, film analysts and researchers have studied the frames and still disagree on whether it shows an unknown creature or a person in a suit. This 1960 Soviet classroom photo shows a girl standing by a blackboard with the phrase, "Girls Honor," a typical moral education topic of that era. Such lessons mixed literature, ethics, and social rules, teaching pupils how Soviet ideals were supposed to shape everyday behavior. Joseph Merrick, known as the Elephant Man, lived in 19th century London with severe deformities now linked to Proteus syndrome and was first shown in traveling sideshows for small pay. This 1983 Soviet photo shows a group of people pushing an almost late passenger up onto a departing train by hand. In the era of manual doors and strict timetables, such platform teamwork was a common way to save someone's journey. This T-34 tank has stayed half-submerged in a swamp near Kursk since 1943, with its crew officially missing in action. Local reports tell of voices and movement inside at night, and several recorded attempts to lift the tank ended in deadly work accidents. In 1946, 20-year-old Princess Elizabeth visited Wales and was dressed in bardic robes to be made an honorary bard at the National Eisteddfod. It was one of her earliest public roles, linking the future queen to Welsh culture years before her coronation. In the 1950s, a mass-produced print called The Crying Boy was noted in Britain for more than 50 reported house fires where the picture was found undamaged on the wall. By 1985, some Yorkshire firefighters said they would not hang the image at home after seeing the same intact print again and again in burned rooms. In 1908, this Sami family on the Kola Peninsula stands outside their cone-shaped hut of poles and bark, built to trap heat and block Arctic winds. Such homes were rebuilt along reindeer routes, letting entire families move with their herds across the tundra. In the 1970s, large Lenin statues were often moved on open trucks like this, lying on their backs and strapped down for installation in new towns or squares. The contrast of the giant monument on the trailer. In 1950 and 1951, American stores sold the U-238 Atomic Energy Lab for children, complete with real uranium ore samples and a working Geiger counter for about $50. After a few thousand kits were bought, concerns about radiation exposure, This 1940s photo shows players from the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, created during the Second World War, sliding hard into base while wearing skirt uniforms and caps. The league drew large crowds and proved that women could play fast. In 1962, students in West Berlin dug the so-called Tunnel 29, a 140-meter passage 12 meters underground beneath the Berlin Wall. Over 6 months, they used shovels, hands, and even spoons to finish it. This 1862 photo shows British Army surgeon Dr. James Barry in Jamaica with his servant John and his dog Psyche. After Barry's death in 1865, it was discovered that the renowned military doctor had been born Margaret Ann Bulkley and had lived publicly as a man to study and practice medicine. In November 1966, the Arno River in Florence rose about 6 meters in a day, flooding streets, churches, museums, and libraries. Mud and water damaged or destroyed roughly 14,000 works of art and millions of books from the Renaissance city. This 1920s photo shows a propaganda tram on Red Square decorated as a coffin with slogans about the burial of Russian capitalism and a call to challenge global capital. Agitation trams like this carried posters, loudspeakers, and lecturers through Soviet cities. In 1962, an underground coal mine fire began beneath Centralia, Pennsylvania, sending hot smoke and gas up through cracks in the streets and yards. Within a few decades, almost all of the town's residents were relocated, while the hidden fire continues to burn in the abandoned mine today. This early 20th century photo shows members of the Ku Klux Klan riding in full costume on covered horses during a night event in the United States. Such public rides were staged as disciplined shows of strength to impress crowds and signal the group's control over local life. In February 1942, anti-aircraft guns around Los Angeles fired about 1,400 shells at supposed enemy aircraft during a night alert, lighting up the sky for an hour. No wreckage was found, and later reviews suggested a false alarm, likely triggered by weather balloons. This experimental pressure suit from 1938 was built from rubberized fabric and metal fittings to keep a pilot alive in the thin air of the stratosphere. It was designed for balloon and high-altitude test flights up to about 30 kilometers, long before spacesuits became standard. On 15 December 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers at Flannan Isles vanished, leaving a set table, burning lamps, and 1 coat still hanging during heavy storm weather. An inquiry blamed a sudden giant wave hitting the West Landing. In 1931, this photo of Azo Basu from the Atlas Mountains in Morocco was briefly promoted by some Europeans as proof that a living Neanderthal had been found. Later medical examinations showed that he and his sisters actually had a rare form of microcephaly, not ancient human ancestry. Bee beards were a circus and fairground stunt where performers placed a caged queen on their chin, so tens of thousands of worker bees clustered on their face and chest. In 1969, a widely reported record involved about 50,000 bees covering one person during a show. This 1958 photo from rural Spain shows a baby being held directly to a goat for feeding at a time when infant formula and bottled milk were too expensive or hard to find in many villages. In post-war countryside, families often relied on goats as a reliable source of fresh milk for both children and adults. Clervius Narcisse was declared dead and buried in Haiti in 1962, yet reappeared 18 years later, claiming a Bokor had used tetrodotoxin poison to paralyze him and force him into slave labor. His original hospital death record still exists. School class in Britain, year 1910. Every child holds a book and stares at the camera as if it were an exam, because smiling in formal photos was still considered childish. This rare image shows how early education meant discipline first and comfort second. In 1911, Bobby Leach became the first man to survive going over Niagara Falls in a metal barrel, though he broke his jaw and both kneecaps. 15 years later, he ironically died after slipping on an orange peel during a simple street walk. In 1900, this scene in Delaware shows a man fastened to a punishment post while a crowd calmly watches, in one of the last American states to keep such public penalties. Only in the 1950s did Delaware finally remove its post from the law books. In the 1890s, a so-called Iron Maiden from Nuremberg, lined with blunt spikes, was used as a live attraction where hired women briefly locked themselves inside to shock paying crowds. After several fainting spells and minor injuries, these shows were stopped. During the Second World War, many young women from China and Southeast Asia were taken by the Japanese Army and forced to live in military camps as so-called comfort women. And this rare photo shows several of them just after being found by Allied troops. A man in a remote Indonesian village sits calmly while covered head to toe in heavy wart-like growths, caused by a very rare condition linked to human papillomavirus, giving his skin the look of rough tree bark. Photographs of people like him spread through medical journals and newspapers in the 20th century. Backstage at the first official Soviet beauty contest, Moscow Beauty, in 1988, contestants posed in bold Western-style swimsuits on ordinary gym equipment instead of a glamorous stage. For millions of viewers, this show became a visual signal that the closed Soviet world was finally allowing Western fashion. On some plantations in the 19th century, people in bondage who tried to escape were forced to wear heavy iron collars with long spikes, sometimes weighing up to 7 kilograms. The spikes made it hard to sleep, lean against anything, or move through brush. In 1957, during the early years of the Soviet thaw, 2 young climbers pose in light summer tops on the snowy slope of Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in Europe. In 19th century Brazil, some plantation owners used this iron mask of Flanders to punish enslaved workers who tried to eat sugarcane or drink alcohol, locking their mouths shut for days at a time. The device became a haunting symbol of plantation abuse. Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space, walks with his relatives in the early 1960s, pushing baby carriages like any young father on a quiet village road. For millions, he was a national hero, but moments like this show how his real life was built from simple family walks, laughter, and everyday peace. Women of the Kayan Lahui people, often called parang, start wearing brass neck coils in early childhood, sometimes reaching over 20 rings that weigh around 10 kilograms and visually lengthen the neck by pressing the shoulders down. In 1922, Germany tested this early atmospheric diving suit, a metal one-man capsule so heavy it had to be lowered into the water by crane, but still let the diver walk on the seabed while staying dry. Its jointed metal arms and round viewing ports made it look like a robot explorer, long before science fiction movies showed anything similar. This rare photo shows a coffle, a line of captured people in the American South linked by iron neck collars and chains, forced to walk for days toward distant markets. Such marches could cover hundreds of kilometers with little rest or care. 2 test pilots pose beside an experimental home-built aircraft so small that, when they climb in, the cockpit is barely higher than a parked car. In the early 1950s, these mini-planes, often powered by modified motorcycle engines and shorter than many family cars. In early 20th century hospitals, standing cages were used to keep restless patients upright for hours or even days, promoted as a calming treatment that stopped them from sitting or lying down. Today, these devices are seen as a dark symbol of how poorly mental health was understood. In this 1915 photo, American schoolchildren performed the Bellamy Salute, the original straight-arm gesture used while reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, when the same gesture later became linked with authoritarian movements in Europe. In the 1920s, some prisons in the American South used heavy iron leg boots, each weighing around 15 kilograms, to slow prisoners and prevent escape. People had to walk, work, and even sleep in them for months, leaving many with permanent damage to their legs and spine. Leo Fender, the quiet engineer who could not play guitar himself, built and repaired instruments until he invented the first mass-produced solid-body electric guitars. His Telecaster and Stratocaster models reshaped live music forever, becoming the main tools of rock, blues, and country legends. Public shame cages like this hung over town squares in Europe into the early 1900s, turning punishment into a spectacle as people were locked in cramped iron boxes above the crowd, with no way to lie down or escape the jeers and thrown garbage below. In 1920s Panama, some prisoners were kept in rope cages hanging over a gorge with only a few knots and hooks between them and the drop below. Such cliffside cells made escape nearly impossible and turned every gust of wind into a reminder of how fragile their freedom was. On some plantations, people who tried to escape were forced to wear a heavy bell collar fitted with several metal bells that rang at every step, turning the wearer into a walking alarm. Many carried it for months, the weight straining the neck while the non-stop jangling made rest. An old man sits exhausted in a nearly empty Moscow shop in 1991, surrounded only by rows of identical jars that show how little there was to buy. In the final months of the Soviet Union, many food stores looked like this, with people standing in lines for hours just to get whatever happened to be on the shelves that day. Patients in early psychiatric hospitals were strapped into this rotating chair and spun up to 100 turns per minute in the hope that dizziness would reset the mind. In reality, the device often caused loss of consciousness, strong nausea, and serious injuries. Andre Stander was a South African police detective who secretly robbed banks on his lunch break, then calmly returned in uniform to investigate his own crimes. Between 1977 and 1983, he carried out dozens of robberies with insider precision. After emancipation, many southern states turned prisons into a business, using convict leasing to send mostly black men in chain gangs to break rocks and build railroads for private companies. Days ran from sunrise to night with iron on their ankles and almost no protection. Japanese soldiers casually buy ice cream from a Filipino street vendor in Manila in early 1942, just months after the city fell during the Second World War. The permit date on the cart quietly marks how everyday business kept going under new rulers. In the 19th century, many enslaved people were branded with hot irons, leaving permanent initials or symbols of the person who claimed to own them stamped into their skin. Long after freedom, those square grids of scars were still visible on backs and shoulders. Playboy bunnies visit wounded veterans at Fort Howard Veterans Hospital in Maryland in 1965, bringing a burst of pop culture glamour into a quiet military ward. At the height of the magazine's fame, Hugh Hefner regularly sent bunnies on goodwill trips like this. A gibbet cage like this once stood by roads in Britain and its colonies, where sentenced people were locked high above the ground, exposed to storms and the eyes of everyone passing by. Even after the punishment ended, the cage was often left hanging for months. German troops crowd around a Goliath-tracked mine, a tiny remote-controlled vehicle packed with up to 100 kilograms of explosives and steered by cable from hundreds of meters away. It was one of the first practical ground drones in history, an expensive machine whose cables often failed in battle. A heavy wooden yoke like this was locked to the necks of runaway enslaved people, so wide they could not lie down, turn their heads, or pass through a doorway without help. Survivors recalled wearing it for weeks or months, a punishment that crushed the body. In the 1960s, USSR, this huge metal duct blew warm air into rows of ZIL trucks so their engines stayed unfrozen and could start at once in -40 winters. Instead of heating every vehicle alone, depots built these central ovens that saved fuel, time, and sometimes entire work shifts in the Arctic cold. At the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, more than 1,200 Igorot people from the Philippines were displayed behind fences in a savage village, ordered to perform staged rituals like eating dog meat for 34 million curious visitors. The show was billed as proof of primitive cultures to justify colonial rule. 13 Brooks sisters crowd around their mother's bed in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in 1954, meeting their first and only brother, newborn Leslie Benjamin, moments after his home birth. For years, the family house was known in town as the House of 13 Girls and One Lucky Boy. In the early 1900s, some southern prison camps used rolling cages, barely big enough to crouch in, pushed along the tracks, while inmates broke stones under the sun. The cage turned a work shift into a moving cell, making escape impossible and rest almost non-existent. In 1958, Mao's campaign against sparrows sent people onto rooftops with pans and flags, forcing the birds to stay in the air until they dropped from exhaustion. With the sparrows gone, insects exploded in number. Crops were stripped bare. At the Paris World's Fair in 1889, people from African colonies were displayed in cages and fenced villages, advertised as living anthropology for curious crowds. For the 28 million visitors, it looked like exotic entertainment. After years in distant prison camps, these American airmen explode with joy as their plane finally carries them home from Vietnam in March 1973. In this packed cabin, every shout and raised fist is the sound of a life suddenly given back its future. At early 20th century world fairs, indigenous people were put on display like living exhibits, ordered to stage their own weddings, meals, and daily life inside cages for curious crowds. This photo shows a native wedding in St. Louis in 1904. A former Sherman tank, its turret removed, trudges across a Chelyabinsk field in 1948, dragging farm equipment instead of rolling into battle. Many of these Lend-Lease machines were too valuable to scrap, so Soviet engineers turned them into heavy tractors that literally helped rebuild the country's farmland. In 1863, showman P.T. Barnum turned the wedding of little performers Tom Thumb and Lavinia Warren into a luxury spectacle, selling 2,000 tickets at $75 each to watch the ceremony. A blind Belarusian street musician turns poverty into a small family craft in 1899, playing a hurdy-gurdy while his wife and young guide stand beside him in a village of the Minsk Governorate. In late 19th century Europe, some towns still used hanging punishment cages barely a meter wide, where a person was locked high above the square, unable to stand or lie down. Crowds gathered below to shout and throw rubbish, while the prisoner hung for days in heat or cold. On the Eastern Front, it was common for hungry civilians to approach enemy camps, and some German soldiers quietly shared their rations with Russian mothers and children despite strict orders. Moments like this could cost a soldier a court-martial, yet they show how simple food sometimes broke through the walls of ideology and war. After 1865, many Southern sheriffs used new vagrancy and loitering laws to arrest black men and lease them back to plantations and mines, chaining them together in ankle irons like the ones in this photo. Each shackle could weigh several kilos, cutting into the skin during 14-hour workdays. In 1961, as the Berlin Wall was still going up, residents in border houses tried to escape by climbing out of their East Berlin windows straight into the west, while police and crowds watched from below. Within weeks, these facades were bricked up and windows sealed. 3 generations of Papuan men posed together in 1970s New Guinea, their faces showing a whole lifetime of jungle life, clan stories, and quiet pride. The younger man's dramatic nose ornament, carved from animal bone or tusk, marks him as an initiated adult warrior. 2 small children in ruined 1945 Germany dig through a pile of abandoned rifles and helmets as if they were toys, surrounded by the wreckage of collapsing houses. For a generation that knew only war, even a battlefield's leftovers became part of their playground. 2 Zulu men in traditional dress lineup shots on a billiard table in 1903 South Africa, calmly mastering a game brought by colonists under lamps and European wall art. This strange mix of beaded ornaments, bare feet, and polished cues shows how quickly foreign pastimes seeped into local life. In 1905, young Mercedes Jelinek confidently holds the wheel of an early car while a crowd of men watch in silent surprise. Her name, used by her racing father, later became the Mercedes brand. From 1946 to 1955, parents in New Jersey entered their babies into crawling races where tiny competitors launched from stalls with nicknames like Donut Dan and Pinup Girl. These unusual contests mixed family fun with clever local advertising. In 1916, an Austrian soldier stands on a narrow bridge inside a glacier in the Dolomite Alps, where freezing storms and hidden cracks made each patrol as dangerous as any battle. High in these mountains, both sides cut tunnels through ice, moved supplies by cable lines over deep voids. In 1929, 3 girls in Cincinnati pose in homemade Halloween costumes, their stiff masks and long noses turning an ordinary yard into something strangely unreal. Before colorful plastic outfits, children often glued paper, cloth, and flour paste into masks. In 1978, Native American activists walked from San Francisco to Washington in the longest walk, a journey of more than 4,000 kilometers. Their march drew national attention and helped stop plans that would harm their land and rights. In 1982, a 24-year-old club singer named Louise Ciccone poses like any other unknown girl in New York. 1 month later, her first album, Madonna, will turn her into a global pop star. In 1890, a giant California sequoia was cut into a single round slab so a wealthy man could win a bet that 40 people could dine at one table. The finished tabletop was shipped all the way to Buckingham Palace, turning a living giant into a showpiece for parties. In 1948, Chicago officers pose on an experimental tandem bike stacked with more than 20 pieces of police gear, from long barrels to signal flares. It was likely built more as a publicity stunt than a real patrol tool, but the sight alone would make most troublemakers think twice. In about 1890, the Brooklyn Bridge stretches over the East River, above steam ferries and cargo ships in a low-rise New York. Behind it, early office blocks and warehouses line the waterfront on the eve of the steel skyscraper boom. In 1903, this scene was filmed for The Great Train Robbery, one of the first narrative Western movies. The film used early cross-cutting and moving camera shots and became a model for later action films. In 1972, survivors of an air crash in the Andes endured 72 days trapped in the mountains. To stay alive in the frozen wreckage, they used every possible resource from the plane and from companions who had already died. In the 19th century, photographers often hid mothers under cloth like this, so babies would stay still during long exposures. The covered figure was later meant to blend into the background, giving the strange impression that the infants sat alone. On April 29, 1975, a helicopter lifts evacuees from a rooftop in Saigon during Operation Frequent Wind, the final American airlift of the Vietnam War. Hundreds of South Vietnamese and American personnel climbed narrow ladders like this one, hoping for one of the last seats out of the city. This photo shows Sadako Sasaki as a child in Hiroshima in 1945, after the city was destroyed by a single blast from the sky. She later became famous for folding hundreds of paper cranes while in hospital, and her story is now used worldwide as a symbol of peace. A Royal Navy jet fighter slid off a runway and came to rest almost fully submerged in a shallow river. Recovery crews later used a crane to lift the intact aircraft out of the water and back onto dry land. In 1943, Aachen Town Hall in Germany stood with its roof smashed and one tower partly destroyed by wartime bombing. Today, the same building is fully restored, with its medieval style carefully rebuilt to match the original details. In 1942, in Leningrad, Red Army soldiers trained from a trench by throwing grenades at a mock tank target. Such exercises taught infantry how to disable enemy armor before they were sent to the front lines. In the 1920s, a crowded hall watches a Soviet auction of former imperial property, with rows of paintings, china, and household items displayed around the stage. Such sales of royal valuables were organized to bring hard currency into the new state after the revolution. In 1993, crowds line a Moscow bridge watching the armed clashes around the Russian White House during the constitutional crisis. The burned-out bus on the embankment is one of the vehicles destroyed in the street, fighting between government forces and supporters of the parliament. In the 1940s, an American B-24 Liberator heavy bomber flies over Europe while bombs burst on the landscape below. This model became one of the most produced heavy bombers in history. In the Soviet Union, children often played with simple, homemade wooden toy rifles and pistols, like the ones these three boys are holding in winter uniforms. Many of these handcrafted toys stayed in families for decades because they were built from solid boards and nails instead of plastic. In 1912, a village wheelwright uses a foot-powered lathe to turn a wooden block into parts for wagon wheels. Wooden wheels like these wore out quickly on rough roads, so craftsmen had steady work replacing broken rims and hubs. Around 1900, Japanese street performers travel with a drum, a dog, and a trained monkey dressed in costume, a form of entertainment known as sarumawashi. Such small family troupes moved from town to town, earning coins by making the animals bow, dance. In 1945, American bombers and their fighter escorts fly in formation on a mission over Europe. The group is heading toward enemy military targets during the final months of the war. In 1914, a captured German spy stands in peasant woman's clothing while soldiers and villagers surround him. Such disguises were sometimes used during the First World War to move through rural areas without drawing notice. In 1904, engineers built the world's first reinforced concrete lighthouse here, a 40-meter tower rising from empty shoreline. The structure was destroyed during the Second World War, so this image is one of the few records of how it once looked. In 1956, a Soviet bakery worker walks with a wooden box marked "Homebread Delivery," packed with fresh loaves. Before online services, door-to-door bread delivery like this let city families receive warm bread without leaving their apartments. Soviet juvenile offenders stand before an official in a Moscow correction center while she writes their details into case papers. Institutions like this were created to separate young offenders from adult prisons and put them into strict work and study programs. In 1949, Ivan Burilov wrote the single-word comedy on his Soviet election ballot. Authorities treated this as an anti-state act and sentenced him to 8 years in a labor camp. Zheng Jinlian, born in 1964 in China, grew to a recorded height of 248 centimeters, making her the tallest woman in documented history. Her rapid growth put heavy strain on her spine, and she died in 1982 at only 17 years old. In 1967, Air Force pilot Robert Henry Lawrence Jr. was chosen for the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program, becoming the first African-American astronaut. Later that year, he died in a training jet crash, so he never flew in space, but his selection opened the way for future black astronauts. In 1892, this Gustav Zander abdominal massager was part of a full line of mechanotherapy machines used in clinics to treat patients with controlled exercise. Zander's devices are considered ancestors of modern gym and physical therapy equipment. In 1900, British soldiers in tropical helmets read fresh newspapers on a dock during the Second Boer War. They are waiting to embark, catching up on reports from South Africa and news from home. Around 1899, a group of new women pose in both tailored suits and elegant dresses, showing how they mixed male and female styles on purpose. This movement pushed for education, work, and personal freedom for women, laying early groundwork for modern women's rights. In 1989, the stunt team for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles relaxes in their heavy foam and animatronic turtle suits between takes. Each performer had to fight, flip, and act while packed inside these bulky costumes that could weigh more than 30 kilograms. On September 19, 1989, a UTA DC-10 flying from Congo to Paris broke apart after an onboard explosive device detonated, killing all 171 people on board. International investigations later concluded that Libyan intelligence officers had organized the attack. In 1988, a crowd in Chelyabinsk presses around a doorway as men pass out bottles during shortages caused by Mikhail Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign. State limits on production and sales left shops with empty shelves, so people queued for hours. In 1941, with nylon stockings scarce during the war, women went to salons where attendants painted hosiery lines directly onto their legs. Special leg makeup and a dark seam down the back created the illusion of real stockings for work and nights out. In September 1944, pilots of the Soviet 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, nicknamed the Night Witches, walked back from a successful mission beside their Po-2 biplanes. These all-female crews flew thousands of low-altitude night raids. During the 1940s, workers and visitors at the Carnegie, Illinois steel plant in Homestead examine a captured German PZKPFW 3rd AOSF-J tank. Allied engineers studied vehicles like this in detail to learn about enemy armor design and improve their own tanks. In the 1950s, Marilyn Monroe prepares her makeup at a dressing table, while in another shot, a young Sean Connery flexes on stage at a bodybuilding contest. Both images show future cinema icons still working on their looks long before the roles that made them world famous. Blanche Monnier, a French woman from a wealthy family, was secretly locked in a small room by her mother and brother for 26 years, from the 1870s until police freed her in 1901. The case shocked France and led to public debate about family abuse, mental illness, and how little the state checked what happened behind closed doors. A Croatian soldier during the early 1990s, Balkan War sits with his rifle under a handwritten plea to God, asking to go to heaven if he dies young, because he has already lived through his own hell on earth. Frontline fighters often covered walls with personal prayers and drawings like this as a way to cope with fear. In 1942, in occupied Poland, Zita Sus has her picture taken after being taken from her family and given new identity papers by Nazi authorities. After the war, she was sent to an orphanage and never found her real parents. Magdalene laundries were church-run institutions where women judged as not respectable enough, including unmarried mothers and girls seen as troublesome, were confined to do heavy washing and ironing. Many operated in Ireland and other countries well into the late 20th century, with residents working without pay. In 1901 in Persia, a student lies on the floor while adults prepare to hit the soles of his feet with a rod, a standard school punishment for laziness. Other boys sit on woven mats with their books, watching a discipline method that many countries would later forbid. In 1930, German designers tested this experimental police body armor made from overlapping metal plates strapped over a suit. The heavy, rigid vest was never widely adopted, but became one of the early steps toward modern, flexible, bullet-resistant gear. In 1870, Empress Maria Feodorovna carries her eldest son, the future Tsar Nicholas II, on her back in Tsarskoye Selo. At this moment, he is simply a royal child in a family portrait, decades before the Russian Empire and his dynasty collapse. These ancient Greek sandals belong to a courtesan and have metal studs that spell "Follow me" in reverse on the sole. As she walked, the message pressed into dust and sand, quietly guiding potential clients toward her company. In 1968, engineers modified a Soviet BTR-50 armored personnel carrier with a high cabin so Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser could ride across rough ground. The special vehicle let him inspect frontline units while still protected by armor. In 1945, a woman rests on a pile of bricks beside a knocked-out German SDKFZ 234/4 heavy armored car with a 75mm PaK-40/2 gun in central Berlin. Only 89 of these vehicles were built, so this wreck is one of the rare machines left amid the ruins after the battle for the city. In 1980, sound designer Ben Burt sits among tape recorders and homemade gear he used to build the voices and effects of Star Wars. He created the hum of the lightsaber, the beeps of R2-D2, the breath of Darth Vader, and the scream of blasters and TIE fighters from everyday noises. In 1917 and 1918, Girl Scouts in Washington collected peach pits so they could be burned into activated carbon for gas mask filters. Millions of such seeds from children across the country ended up inside masks that protected soldiers from poison gas. In 1986, Soviet liquidators at Chernobyl were fitted with improvised lead aprons and plates like this before working near the destroyed reactor. The makeshift gear gave only brief protection, so each worker was allowed just a few minutes in the most radioactive zones before being rushed back out. In April 1943, First Lieutenant Louis Zamperini looks through the battle damage in his B-24 bomber Superman after a raid on Japanese-held Nauru. 1 month later, he survived a crash in another B-24 and drifted 47 days at sea before being captured. In the 1970s, Rhodesian security forces patrol past a burning thatched hut during an operation against guerrilla fighters in the Bush War. The conflict pitted the white minority government of Ian Smith against nationalist movements until a settlement and elections in 1979 led to majority rule. In 1958, a miner rescued after 5 days trapped underground in the Spring Hill, Nova Scotia disaster lies in hospital while his young daughter gently touches his face. He is one of 12 men pulled out alive after the mine bump that day. In 1939, crowds line up outside a New York theater for the premiere of MGM's new Technicolor fantasy, The Wizard of Oz, starring Judy Garland. The film did modest business at first, but later re-released television showings turned it into one of the most famous movies in cinema history. In 1901 in London, Adelaide Springett chose to stand barefoot for Horace Warner's camera because she felt ashamed of her worn-out shoes. Her portrait later became a stark record of how poor children in Britain lived at the start of the 20th century. In 1925, filmmakers from Pathé Exchange shot a rooftop stunt for the silent movie Play Ball on top of New York's Algonquin Hotel, with actress Alan Ray hanging from a high ledge while Walter Miller rescued her. To keep the dangerous scene as real as possible, they used only basic safety pads. Summer 1942. A German Nadelwerfer, 41 battery near Demyansk, fires a salvo, the rockets caught in mid-flight with bright exhaust trails. These 6-barrel rocket launchers could send high explosive or smoke projectiles over 7 kilometers and were feared for their loud, howling sound. Heavy Matilda tanks are being lifted onto ships in a British port in 1943, part of the massive Lend-Lease convoys sailing to the Soviet Union. These slow but heavily armored machines became some of the first foreign tanks to fight on the Eastern Front. New York City, 1968. A strike by all 7,000 sanitation workers turned entire neighborhoods into trash-filled canyons in just a few days. By the 9th day, more than 100,000 tons of waste lay in the streets, forcing the governor to step in with a pay raise and end the standoff. In Paris in the year 1900, 2 Dutch rowers, Francois Brandt and Roloff Klein, replaced their heavy cocks with an unknown local boy of about 8 years and won Olympic gold. This child, likely the youngest Olympic champion in history, was picked up on the street. Nurses dust a little girl with DDT powder to stop lice in post-war Germany on 1 October 1945. The chemical was praised then as a miracle shield against insects, and only years later did people learn how harmful it could be for health and nature. New Zealander Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay smile after becoming the first confirmed team to stand on the summit of Everest on 29 May 1953. Their climb to 8,850 meters turned a little-known Himalayan peak into the most famous mountain on Earth. George Joseph Smith, seen here with 2 of his wives, became infamous after 3 spouses died in bathtubs soon after he insured them, all in almost the same way. The scandal forced British courts to treat repeating crime patterns as powerful evidence. During the 1965 Giro d'Italia, riders had to climb off their bikes and fight through a corridor of snow taller than themselves on a high mountain pass. This icy stage, with bikes carried more than ridden, became one of the race's most iconic images and a symbol of how far cyclists will push their bodies to reach the finish. Workers at the Kamaz plant line up for their salary in 1993, receiving bricks of banknotes that barely fit on the cashier's desk. During Russia's wild inflation that year, wages were paid in huge stacks of cash that could lose value before people even made it home. A huge crowd gathers in Toronto in November 1919 to protest new rules that required smallpox vaccination. The city had just faced a serious smallpox outbreak, and this clash between public health orders and personal freedom shows that arguments over vaccines are more than 100 years old. A Soviet tanker shares a shot of strong drink with a British sapper in May 1945, just after the battles in Europe have ended. For many Allied soldiers, quick toasts like this on tank armor marked the moment when strangers from opposite sides of the continent became brothers in victory. King George V bends down to speak with a young coal miner in Sunderland in 1911, the boy smiling in his worn work clothes as he meets a real king. At that time, thousands of children in Britain spent long hours in the mines, so this cheerful scene quietly shows how hard everyday life was for many families. This eerie desert field in Nevada is covered with craters left by decades of underground atomic tests by 1996. Each perfect circle is a frozen shockwave in the sand, a quiet reminder of how far Cold War science was willing to go. A cafe shows off an early 20th century gadget that dunks donuts into coffee without using your hands. Such quirky inventions were popular marketing tricks, turning a simple coffee break into a little mechanical show. German commander Erwin Rommel pauses during the North African campaign in 1942 to pose after a hunting trip, a side of him rarely seen in wartime photos. Shots like this also show how much views on wildlife and trophy hunting have changed, as many big cats are now strictly protected. A crashed helicopter lies on the set of the film Twilight Zone in the United States, 1982, after a night scene went horribly wrong. The incident led to major changes in movie safety rules, as studios were forced to rethink how they used aircraft and special effects on set. An American Army medic gently bandages the leg of a wounded German soldier, proving the Red Cross on his arm mattered more than the insignia on the helmet. Under Geneva rules, medics were trained to help any injured person they found, and quiet moments like this took place all across the battlefields of the 1940s. Finnish soldiers in white winter suits collect frozen loaves from an overturned Soviet truck on the Raate-Suomussalmi Road in 1940. On this icy front line, captured bread could matter as much as ammunition, keeping small units moving in -40-degree cold. A mule collapses in its harness after being struck by a shell fragment near Remy, France, in September 1918. In the First World War, more than 1 million horses and mules hauled guns and supplies on the Western Front, often facing the same dangers as the soldiers beside them. A Dutch boy throws himself into the mud to help a British Army postman push his motorcycle out of a flooded road in 1944. The postman's bags carried letters from home, so this small act of help meant hope and news could still reach soldiers at the front. A publicity line of Leach refuse getter sanitation trucks poses with local models for the city of St. Petersburg, Florida, around 1947. Post-war American towns often staged such photos to show off modern street cleaning fleets as symbols of prosperity, hygiene, and civic pride. German housewife Elisabeth Gloeden stands before a Nazi court in 1944 for helping the July 20th plotters who tried to remove Adolf Hitler from power. An ordinary citizen drawn into high-level resistance, she paid with her life when the regime crushed the conspiracy. Oskar Schindler stands in Jerusalem in 1962, surrounded by men and women he had once saved through his factory during the war. The joyful crowd around him is living proof that a single businessman's risky choices rescued more than 1,000 people from planned deportation and death camps.